let's talk about snare drums. As you can see from the course plan, I've split this up into 4 parts because I think snares are really important. I spend a lot of time obsessing over them and I have a lot to say on snare drums. So I hope you can forgive me for indulging in that obsession a bit. I think there's a lot of useful techniques I'll be able to show you on them. So I want to spend this first part just discussing the basic anatomy of a snare drum, then we'll go into how to synthesize a snare drum of your own. I'm not saying you always need to make your own snares, you can just use a sample pack if you want. But I feel like I should include it in this course, so if you're interested in learning how to make your own snares, watch that next lesson. If you're not interested, you can skip that, and then we'll go into layering, sort of using snare samples you've already made or you've gotten from someone else, and layering them up with different things to watch out for to sort of prevent phase cancellation and things like that, muddiness, all that kind of stuff. And then we'll also go into processing and mixing, so like EQ, compression, transient shaping, some other tricks you can do to make a snare sound a bit more appropriate for a given mix. The reason I spend so much time on snare drums is simply because most mixes kind of, at least in the genres I work in, which are like drum and bass, hip-hop, glitch, dubstep, pop music also does this a lot, jazz even, anything where kind of the kick and the snare are the main drums. Usually the kick is more of a bottom end provider and not really that active in the high end. Around like 3K is where our ear is most sensitive, so it's really the snare that's the loudest drum, that's always in our ear's most sensitive range, that's repeated every bar multiple times. So it really does a lot to shape the character of a mix and to kind of shape the texture of a mix. So I think spending some time getting your snare drum right really can do a lot for getting the overall sort of sonic profile of your mix right and getting the overall texture, the overall vibe correct. So that's why I'm gonna spend so much time on snare drums. So in this first one, I just want to have a look at some different snares, show you some different things they all tend to have in common. In terms of frequency profile, envelope, that kind of stuff. You can see I've made a few notes here. So I'll just play with these snares first, and then I'll go through these little bullet points here and sort of talk about the different characteristics, because understanding this kind of stuff will make synthesizing, mixing snares a lot easier, because we have a kind of basic anatomy in mind, these are the different components. If a snare sounds off, which of these components is the problem and how can we fix it? So that's kind of a nice way to get some overview. So let's listen to some snares here. Some of these are acoustic, some I made myself, some others have made. Okay, so maybe start with the most obvious thing first. So the envelope of the snare drum describes the loudness profile over time. You can see that in essence it's just a downward kind of slope. You can see usually the first bit is the loudest, more or less. You can see here it starts the loudest and then it decreases in volume, and then you've got this longer tail and it's sort of a slightly curved envelope. The longer it stays loud, the louder it's gonna sound, but also the less snappy it's gonna sound. We're gonna see more about that in the video on snare mixing. Then we've got sort of 3 stages I like to think of, both for synthesis and for layering and stuff. So we've got the initial transient of a snare, which is kind of the initial click, snap. So if we take maybe the snare for example here, the transient is really only the first bit, so the first few milliseconds of this. So let's just split this and just listen to the transient. It's kind of the attack part. The snare actually doesn't have a great transient, so maybe let's switch to this one here. You can see the transient usually has a lot of high frequency. It's usually very dense. If we listen to the snare, then just isolate the transient here, it's really short, but it can make a lot of difference in how the snare is perceived. So if we listen to just the transient here, it's really just this little click here. But getting this right, especially in synthesis, is really helpful. So if we listen to the snare without its transient, it's gonna have a lot harder time kind of cutting through a mix. Sometimes the transient can also be too much. but we'll get into that later. Second is sort of the body of the snare. This is where most of the tuned kind of content is. So you can see the second part here. This is sort of where the fundamental of the snare sits. It's this kind of donk sound that comes after the transient. This is quite a bit longer, and this has a lot of influence on how loud the snare is perceived. And then we've got lastly the tail here. This is usually where a lot of character is, where you'll be layering in different Foley bits. And this kind of just rings out. Sometimes you'll be wanting to cut this short. This has a lot of tonal stuff. If we just listen to this, you can hear it sort of has some metallic resonances, but it doesn't really have the same kind of donkey sound of the membranes of the snare drum you can get with this body part. Now, frequency component wise, the way I usually think about snares is, you can see all of these have this in common, that they have a kind of fundamental, which is a kind of single most resonant harmonic around 200 Hertz. You can see here we're at around 200 Hertz. Tends to be where they sit. You can see some are a bit higher, up to 250, even 300. Some are at 180 or something like that. And then we've got here, you can see all of these kind of, they sit around 200 Hertz, a bit higher, a bit lower. Then we've got sort of the, let's maybe actually listen to this on an EQ, so you can kind of isolate the different parts better. So if we take EQ8 here, we can kind of isolate different frequency ranges. So we can just, by clicking this little arrow thingy, we just hear a certain range. So let's start with a fundamental. This is kind of where the body is, where a lot of the loudness and a lot of the perceived weight of the snare comes from. A lot below 200 Hertz is usually mud. So you can see we can kind of cut here, and it won't be missing too much. It'll be missing a little maybe. But once we start cutting 200 Hertz here, it sounds really thin and really weak. So this is kind of where our fundamental sits, where we would be placing our sine and synthesizing them. Then we've got this sort of low mids area. This is where a lot of the weight comes from. So if we take this out here, it sounds a lot thinner. If we boost this, it kind of sounds a lot heavier. Then around 1K, we've got this kind of snappy area, where some higher harmonics are placed. You can hear how it kind of sounds a bit almost like a kick drum without this 1K. Because it's just got this lower weight and then this higher sort of fizzle. I mostly think of the highs as like decoration for the snare. Then 3K is sort of where it gets quite sharp here in the highs. Also where a lot of the snap can come from, and then above like 5K or something, this depends on the snare, you mostly get like this high frequency, this kind of this fizzly part. So you can damp a snare, and this will kind of sound like there's a cloth laying on the snare or something. And you can also boost these highs to get a lot of more brightness and sort of sizzle from your snare drums. And these kind of interact with these stages of the envelope. So you will see that the fundamental is mostly present in the body stage here. If we set the spectrum analyzer to something a bit faster, I'll just maybe make this like very fast. You can see how it's sort of, you've got the attack here, that's usually full spectrum. So like everywhere should be present in the transient. Then you've got this body here, you can see it's mostly one waveform, where sort of the fundamental is loudest, and then the fundamental kind of stops here in the later part. See, it's not really present anymore, it's like a tiny bit here, because the tail is mostly going to be high frequency stuff, and mostly going to be kind of decoration of Foley stuff. You can hear a lot of the character of the snare can be in the tail. So you can add like different layers and stuff here. Different kind of hi-hats, whatever. Sorry. You can add a lot of different sort of longer tails. We'll be going more into the layering part and that later on. You can hear how I've layered sort of different bits of Foley in here. While the initial part is sort of more donkiness. So yeah, this is sort of the anatomy of a snare drum, mostly just as an overview. I want to keep this relatively short, and then in the next lesson I'll just walk you through my full process of making a snare. It's going to be over an hour long, if I remember correctly, so if you want to skip that because you're not interested in making your own snares, you just want to use a sample pack, feel free. But I think learning to synthesize your own snares, even if you're not always going to do it, will actually make you better at mixing them, will actually make you better at understanding these different components. That's how I learned these kind of different stages of it. And that's how I also learned to train my ear to sort of listen for these different stages and listen for, okay, what exactly is bothering me about the snare. Because a lot of beginners often struggle with having the snare and they think it sounds like shit, but they don't really know why. And sort of identifying in which of these stages and which frequency ranges the problem lies, or where something might be missing, is really important and really helpful, and something that you can learn from at least experimenting with making your own snare drums. So yeah, see you on that second one, and then we'll move on to layering and mixing.